seemed to bluster with prosperity, but which the loss of a dozen points at whist will reduce that currish aspect which reminds one of a dog whip. Mr. Camperdown's countenance, when Lord Fawn and Mr. Eustace left him, had fallen away into this meanness of appearance. He no longer carried himself as a man owning a dog whip, but rather as the hound that feared it. A better attorney for the purposes to which his life was devoted did not exist in London than Mr. Camperdown. To say that he was honest is nothing. To describe him simply as zealous would be to fall very short of his merits. The interests of his clients were his own interests, and the legal rights of the properties of which he had the legal charge were as dear to him as his own blood. But it could not be said of him that he was a learned lawyer. Perhaps in that branch of a solicitor's profession in which he had been called upon to work, experience goes further than learning. It may be doubted, indeed, whether it is not so in every branch of every profession. But it might, perhaps, have been better for Mr. Camperdown had he devoted more hours of his youth to reading books on conveyancing. He was now too old for such studies, and could trust only to the reading of other people. The reading, however, of other people was always at his command, and his clients were rich men who did not mind paying for an opinion. To have an opinion from Mr. Dove, or some other learned gentleman, was the everyday practice of his life. And when he obtained, as he often did, little cogents of legal vantage and settled definitions as to property which were comfortable to him, he would rejoice to think that he could always have a Dove at his hand to tell him exactly how far he was justified in going in deference to his client's interests. But now there had come to him no comfort from his corner of legal knowledge. Mr. Dove had taken extraordinary pains in the matter, and had simply succeeded in throwing over his employer. "A necklace can't be an heirloom," said Mr. Camperdown to himself, telling off his fingers half a dozen instances in which he had either known or had heard that the head of a family had so arranged the future possession of the family jewels. Then he again read Mr. Dove's opinion, and actually took a law book off his shelves with the view of testing the correctness of the barrister in reference to some special assertion. A pot or a pan might be an heirloom, but not a necklace! Mr. Camperdown could hardly bring himself to believe that this was law. And then, as to paraphernalia, up to this moment, though he had been called upon to arrange great dealings in reference to widows, he had never as yet heard of a claim made by a widow for paraphernalia. But then the widows with whom he had been called upon to deal had been ladies quite content to accept the good things settled upon them by the liberal prudence of their friends and husbands, not greedy, blood-sucking harpies such as this Lady Eustace. It was quite terrible to Mr. Camperdown that one of his clients should have fallen into such a pit. Mors omnibus est communis. But to have left such a widow behind one! "John," he said, opening his door. John was his son and partner, and John came to him, having been summoned by a clerk from another room. "Just shut the door. I've had a scene here. Lord Fawn and Mr. Greystock almost coming to blows about that horrid woman." "The Upper House would have got the worst of it, as it usually does," said the young attorney. "And there is John Eustace cares no more what becomes of the property than if he had nothing to do with it. Absolutely talks of replacing the diamonds out of his own pocket. A man whose personal interest in the estate is by no means equal to her own." "He wouldn't do it, you know," said Camperdown Junior, who did not know the family. "It's just what he would do," said the father, who did. "There's nothing they wouldn't give away when once the idea takes them. Think of that woman having the whole Portray estate, perhaps for the next 60 years, nearly the free simple of the property, just because she made eyes to Sir Florian." "That's dead and gone, father." "And here's Dove tells us that a necklace can't be an heirloom unless it belongs to the Crown." "Whatever he says, you'd better take his word for it." I'm not so sure of that. It can't be. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll go over and see him. We can file a bill in Chancery, I don't doubt, and prove that the property belongs to the family and must go by the will. But she'll sell them before we can get the custody of them. Perhaps she has done that already. Greystock says they are at Portray, and I believe they are. She was wearing them in London only in July, a day or two before I saw her as she was leaving town. If anybody like a jeweller had been down at the castle, I should have heard of it. She hasn't sold them yet, but she will. She could do that just the same if they were an heirloom. No, John, I think not. We could have acted much more quickly and have frightened her. If I were you, father, I'd drop the matter altogether and let John Eustace replace them if he pleases. We all know that he would never be called on to do anything of the kind. It isn't our sort of business. Not £10,000, said Camperdown senior, to whom the magnitude of the larceny almost ennobled the otherwise mean duty of catching the thief. Then Mr. Camperdown rose, and slowly walked across the New Squire Lincoln's Inn, under the low archway, by the entrance to the old court in which Lord Eldon used to sit, to the old square, in which the turtle dove had built his legal nest on a first floor, close to the old gateway. Mr. Dove was a gentleman who spent a very great portion of his life in this somewhat gloomy abode of learning. It was not now term time, and most of his brethren were absent from London, recruiting their strength among the Alps, or drinking in vigour for fresh campaigns with the salt sea breezes off Kent and Sussex, or perhaps shooting deer in Scotland, or catching fish in Connemara. But Mr. Dove was a man of iron, who wanted no such recreation. To be absent from his law books and the black, littered, ink-stained old table on which he was wont to write his opinions was, to him, to be wretched. The only exercise necessary to him was that of putting on his wig and going into one of the courts that were close to his chambers, but even that was almost distasteful to him. He preferred sitting in his old armchair, turning over his old books in search of old cases, and producing opinions which he would be prepared to back against all the world of Lincoln's Inn. He and Mr. Camperdown had known each other intimately for many years, and though the rank of the two men in their profession differed much, they were able to discuss questions of law without any appreciation of that difference between themselves. The one man knew much, and the other little. The one was not only learned, but possessed also of great gifts, while the other was simply an ordinary clear-headed man of business. But they had sympathies in common which made them friends. They were both honest and unwilling to sell their services to dishonest customers, and they equally entertained a deep-rooted contempt for that portion of mankind who thought that property could be managed and protected without the intervention of lawyers. The outside world to them was a world of pretty, laughing, ignorant children, and lawyers were the parents, guardians, pastors, and masters by whom the children should be protected from the evils incident to their childishness. "Yes, sir, he's here," said the Turtle Dove's clerk. "He is talking of going away, but he won't go. He's told me I can have a week, but I don't know what I like to leave him. Mrs. Dove and the children are down at Ramsgate, and he's here all night. He hadn't been out for so long that when he wanted to go as far as the Temple yesterday, we couldn't find his hat." Then the clerk opened the door and ushered Mr. Camperdown into the room. Mr. Dove was the younger man by 5 or 6 years, and his hair was still black. Mr. Camperdown's was nearer white than grey, but nevertheless Mr. Camperdown looked as though he were the younger man. Mr. Dove was a long, thin man, with a stoop in his shoulders, with deep-set, hollow eyes and lantern cheeks, and sallow complexion, with long, thin hands, who seemed to acknowledge by every movement of his body and every tone of his voice that old age was creeping on him, whereas the attorney's step was still elastic and his speech brisk. Mr. Camperdown wore a blue frock and a coloured cravat and a light waistcoat,